Hi, I'm Anthony Ward and welcome to this tutorial for 3D World magazine. What we're going to look at during the course of this tutorial is basically how to take a pre-made model, and in this case we're going to take the one that you can see in front of you, which is a futuristic space dock loader, and we are going to apply a full set of UVs and then we will apply a texture to it. Now we're not going to end with a nice clean crisp shiny texture like it's just come up fresh off the production line. We want to take things a bit further and make this look like it's actually been out, it's been used, there's been damage applied to it, so the paint's chipped away, the corners are worn away, there's dirt and debris. So it just gives it a lot more character and makes it a lot more interesting to look at. So all the scenes which I'm going to be working through will be downloadable through the scene files, so feel free to download those and follow along as I go through this. So the first scene we're looking at here, and we have our model built and in front of us, but at the moment it's looking a bit low polygon, a bit low poly, particularly the lamp here. Now this is a model which is just been brought in and combined, so it's just a single mesh. So if you were modelling in a different package, for example, exported as an OBJ, brought it in, it may come in as a single mesh. So don't worry about that just for now. We can separate this off and then work on individual elements as we go. But going back to the fact that it's looking a bit boxy, now this is because it was modelled using subdivision surfaces. So this allows you to use a low polygon proxy model, which then the algorithms calculate and smooth and soften. And in Maya, all we need to do is press 3. Press 3, works its magic, and there we go. So that's now nice and smooth and soft. If we just look in the attribute editor for our smooth mesh options, you can find them down here. Here we have smooth mesh preview, and that's just turning that on and off, which is pretty much what we did when we pressed 3. You have your preview division levels here, so that is how many times this is being divided in the viewport. And obviously you can drop that down to 1, 0, 2 and higher. The higher it goes, the more of a hit it's going to have on the processing power. So 2, the default, usually works as quite a good default. You can also disable this, so when you're coming to rendering, you can have more divisions in the model when it renders, so it smooths it out just an extra little bit there, rather than just using the preview levels there. But for now, we're just happy. Press 1 to drop, 3 to go back to smooth mesh. So you've got your smooth model in here. Now we need to start to think about how we're going to UV this. So straight away I can see that there are quite a lot of elements which are duplicated or mirrored. So the limbs, for example, they look like they're exactly the same. It's just his left hand side have been mirrored across to create the right hand side. So there's no point in us UVing two identical objects, so you may as well just spend the time UVing one side and then mirror those, and then if you need to, move the UVs for the newly mirrored side. So you'll still end up with two lots of UVs to work on, so you can have unique textures on each side. It's just you're not doing two amounts of work up front generating two lots of UVs. So your first task would be to just go through, strip down the model, separate it, and just leave you with just the main parts which you were going to focus on with the UVing. So I've already done this, and you can find this in these layers down here. So we'll hide that, load in stripped, and as you can see, this is a lot more, well, it's much more of a simplified model than it was before. We have one post, one of these bars here, one side of the limbs. Like I said, we can just mirror the limbs across when we've UV'd them. So we're not doubling up on our workload. So now let's just dive right in and start to apply some UVs. Now before you do, there's one thing you need to think about, and that is, do you keep your mesh using smooth mesh, or do you actually apply a smooth operation to the model? Now the reason for this is when you are playing with UVs, particularly on a mesh that's had smooth mesh applied, Maya doesn't really work with it nicely when you're unfolding, because the geometry, because there's not as much geometry in there, it sort of gets confused. Let me just show you as an example. So let's pick this model here. Let's just press Shift-I to isolate. What I'm going to do is assign an existing material, which is a checker map. Now you can't see anything at the moment, so I'm just going to create UV, planar map. Let's just plane our map from the front. So down the Z-axis, apply. So there we have our UVs applied. And because we've projected it from the front, we've got stretching at the top and the bottom, and the back is reversed. So we need to unfold this so that it's just one strip, so that these grids here and these numbers flow over the surface in a more uniform manner. Because if you imagine when you go in to paint your textures, the textures are going to be stretched here and they're going to be reversed here. So let's just go into our UV texture editor. So here are our UVs currently. So before we unfold this, we need to dictate a seam, and this is where the UVs are going to be cut, which will allow it to sort of be peeled open. So usually you want to put your seams in places where they're not going to be seen, or try and hide them as much as you can. And as this is between the main body and the arm, let's just create a seam at the bottom here. So go to polygon, cut UV edges, and now all we would normally do is we right click, unfold selected UVs. Let's just move this down. I'll just reset this setting here. Now when I'm working in Maya with UVs, I like to sort of follow this same procedure no matter what I'm UVing, be it a head, be it a nice cylinder like this model is, or a cube. This is exactly the same process that I follow for no matter what I'm doing. So let's have a look at this then. So this will unfold the UVs. Now you have pinning here, so you can pin certain UVs, and you have constraints. So rather than go and do a constraint of none, if I click apply now, you'll see it just goes completely wrong. So if we undo that, so first of all you want to constrain it. So because we want to peel this open and sort of vertically rather than horizontally first, we want to constrain it to the vertical axis. Click apply, and as you can see, it's not unfolded as nicely as you'd imagine, and this is because this is down to us using smooth mesh. Now as I said, because there's not a lot of topology in there, Maya's getting confused because it's trying to calculate between the vertices, and when you apply a smooth mesh to an object, it's so that there isn't actually any extra geometry in there to smooth the object. So we need to trick Maya into thinking there's more geometry in this model than there actually is. So let's just close this down. Let's undo that. So we could go in, unfold this, and then go in and move the vertices around and try and fix it ourselves. Now this is a much more simplified model, so you could possibly go in and fix those by hand anyway. But I'm just going to show you a quick procedure which allows you to keep the smooth mesh model, so you keep the low resolution model, but you can also get a nice layout of the UVs. So what we're going to do is we are first going to duplicate this model and just move it to one side. Press 1 to disable smooth mesh, and then I'm going to go in and actually bake in a single division into the model. So we're just going to smooth the UV, smooth all, click apply, and as you can see from here, if we compare the models, that has a lot more geometry in there. But what we can do now is if we go back to our unfold options, go to vertical, click apply, as you can see that has unfolded in a much nicer way, and it's a lot easier for us to now go in and edit this to get what we want. So let's just move this over here for a second, make this a little bit bigger. So the top, we just want to constrain those, just align all these just to make this nice and neat. Let's just minimize that. We'll select that edge like so, convert the selection to UVs, and then we'll pin those to that side there. Well, not pin, but we're just snapping all those and aligning them so they're in a nice straight line, or we could just select them like so and like that. Now we can select the UVs in the middle, and now we want to spread it horizontally because we don't want to do it vertically, otherwise we're going to have to realign the top and the bottom. Click apply, and you see that spreads out nicely. Now we can select all but the top and the bottom and do that vertically like so. So now we've got a nice set of UVs on that model. So at this stage you could say, right, I'm not bothered, I'm quite happy to have a higher polygon count in this scene, so I'm just going to delete this lower res model and we'll just use that, and we'll smooth every model and fix the UVs this way. But having more geometry in a scene isn't always a good thing. Perhaps you want to be a bit more flexible with your geometry. So having all these extra vertices in here is going to make it a lot more difficult to play around with this model later on, or if you want to do more with the UVs. Whereas something like this, there's a lot fewer vertices to play around with. Also, if you're adding more geometry to this model, it's going to increase your file size. So you have to sort of play around and think with what is going to suit your pipeline the best. So let's just take this a step further. We have our UVs fixed on this model, but we want those UVs on this model here. So all we need to do is select our high res model, add the low res model to that selection, go to mesh, transfer attributes. And in here we can transfer all sorts of things between models, vertex normals, vertex positions. What we want is UV sets, and we'll set that to all for now. And we want to set our sample space to local. Click apply, and you see something changed in here. So that's our high res model with the UVs that we fixed, and that's our low res model. And as you can see, those UVs are now laid out very nicely. They'll be a lot easier for us to play around with if we eventually have to come in and tweak the UVs. And we've got a lot less geometry to play around with. So let's just delete the history on that, delete by type history, and now we can delete our high res model because we've got our low res UVs here. If we just reduce that down, because don't forget our texture page is going to be restricted to this grid square here, so that's obviously going to be too big, so let's just reduce that down a little bit. So that's just showing you a quick way, if you're opting to use smooth mesh, as we are going to be throughout this tutorial, if you're having problems with UVing a certain object, then duplicate it, add a smooth, fix the UVs on the smooth model, because then you've got the extra topology in there, so the unfold tools will work much better. Fix the UVs up however you like, and then transfer the attributes back across. So let's close this down. And bring that back. So you can now follow that exact same procedure on all the other elements of this model. So let's look at something else quickly. Let's look at this here. Obviously these models here, it's just a cylindrical map and planard from each side. So let's again isolate that, assign a checker map. Now for this, we want to project from the side and keep the model intact, keep the UVs nice and flat on each side. The area where we're going to have problems is going to be this unfolding and unwrapping the section around the middle, but we'll get to that shortly. So let's just go to create UVs planar map. We want to project from the x-axis this time, so let's click there, and what we're going to do, just select those faces there, and we can either select them right to that edge, or maybe just play it safe and have just one polygon border around there, because if we're painting textures, particularly if we want to paint wear and tear on these corners here, we want the texture to overlap nicely. So it might make sense to just keep this flat area, which is running around the middle, just one division in. So let's create another projection now from the front, like so. So there we have the sides are done, the front is done, much like we did with our cylinder, but obviously one side is mirrored and the back needs some work. So let's open up our UV texture editor. So first of all, let's switch to UVs, select this side, holding down Control, which brings up this menu, and we're going to go to UV shell. And I'm just going to go to flip, and just flip those horizontally. And then we'll move them across, just so we can see, just to separate those out. And just as a test, before I do anything else, I'm just going to see how these unfold. So let's just unfold those horizontally first, vertically, and that seems to be working okay. So we don't, in this instance, we may not need to go in and do the baking a subdivision option and then transferring the UVs across. But let's see what it looks like on this bit here. So again, we need to dictate where our seams are going to be. Now we know down here and up here we have those cylinders which are acting as the knee and as the ankle. So they would be a good place to hide the UVs. So just double click that edge there, and that's selected the top and the bottom for us. So let's go into our UV editor, and we can just deselect those edges because we don't want to cut down here, but we do want to cut across there. So we can now decide, do we want this as one continuous strip or two strips, and it might be easier to have them as two strips. We can have these seams in here anyway, so that doesn't really matter. So polygon, cut UV edges. Let's just separate these out just so we can see each UV shell. So again, let's try our unfold options. So first we're going to try and unfold them horizontally and see how they look. Apply. As you can see, it's not really worked, so we're going to have to go in and use our smooth mesh route. So duplicate, move that across, turn off smooth mesh, but then go into mesh, smooth, and it'll keep the same settings which we had previously. Now let's select these, unfold vertically. Oh, hang on, I think I unfolded it the wrong way before. We want it to be vertical, not horizontal. Let's just give this a try. No, it's still not working properly, so let's undo that. Right, on our smoothed model, unfold vertically, click apply, and you see that has just worked very nicely from the outset. Move that up. Let's just check the orientation of those. So that needs to be rotated like so. Just make sure all the numbers are the right way around. Now obviously they're going to be they go underneath here, so that doesn't really matter. So those UVs are looking a lot nicer. Let's just try a horizontal, just to see if we can spread it out a little bit more. And like we did before, you could go in and align the top and the bottom if you want these to be nicely laid out. Vertical, apply, horizontal, apply, and you can just continue on like that, just tweaking these just a little bit, adjusting the boundaries of each UV shell, and then using the unfold constraints just to smooth those out and just to fix those up a bit. But let's say those are done. Let's say we're happy with the UV layout. Now we can just go back like we did before, select them both, mesh, go to transfer attributes, and it'll keep the settings which we had previously. Select that. And sometimes, as we can see here, there are just slight issues. Everything else looks fine. So it's worth going in and just double checking. So let's just delete by type history. Let's delete that. Now this is probably because some edges aren't sewn together. So let's just select those, sew UV edges, and that's just cleaned that up now. And one last thing to check, with all of these models, just press Ctrl and A, look in our smooth mesh options down here and in extra controls, and just make sure map borders is set to smooth all. I'll just show what this does. If I open up the UVs, smooth all, you see how we had that. If we have it set to smooth internal, you get these areas of where it's pinched here. So if I just, actually let's just show it in here. If I zoom up, scroll up, if I turn off smooth mesh preview, this is how the UVs are without the smooth mesh applied, and you can see here this is where the border is. We turn on smooth mesh and it's keeping those vertices on that border, but we don't want that, we want them to smooth out as well. So just make sure for every model, smooth all, it's always set to smooth all. And there you go, it's just opened those edges up. So there we have the nicely laid out UVs applied to a low resolution model, and I've just demonstrated how to do it on two different shapes. So what you can do now is just follow that exact same procedure and work your way around the model, just doing it to each and every part. So let's just bring back everything else. Let's go back here and let's load in one that I've done earlier. So here we can see a fully UV'd model. If we open up the UV texture editor, we can just have a quick look at the UVs. At the moment, they're all over the place. That's the torso and the main bulk of the torso there. The upper arm, the lower arm, that lower leg, thigh section there, which we've just done. All these different sections here. And you can divide it up and apply the UVs how best suits you. Just make sure they're all nicely laid out and there's enough rooms, particularly around these edges here where we have a bevel. If I turn off smooth mesh, you see that they're quite close together, these edges here. If I turn on smooth mesh, now we've got a nice, it spreads it out, but not, the UVs don't always spread out as much, so check those edges as well. So if we select the whole model now, we can see as we've been working, our UV shells have started to overlap. They are not laid out properly and we can't currently paint on these. So what we need to do now is just decide how we're going to lay these out on a texture page. The first thing you should do though, because we've got this checker map applied, is go through and try and make sure each of these numbers here is roughly the same size on each element. So this, for example, the numbers on there maybe need to be a bit bigger, so like so. The numbers on here maybe need to be or on here for example, maybe needs to be a little bit smaller. Keeping these the same size throughout the model means that the texture space will be spread evenly throughout the mesh. As you can imagine, if the UVs on this lamp here were huge, like so, once you laid out your UVs, that would have lots of texture space, even though when you look at the whole model, it doesn't need all that texture space. So first of all, go through, lay out all the UV shells, well, scale all the UV shells, just so they're more uniform in size, and they're all roughly the same shape. So now you need to think about how you're going to lay out your texture page. And this sort of model, I would say, wouldn't benefit from having a single page. There are lots of little elements on this model, and we're going to be adding in lots of details. So it makes sense for us to maybe spread this across 2 texture pages. So to make things easier, it would make sense to have the whole torso, if I can select that, nope, the whole torso model and these sort of hip sections here, all these on one texture page, and then we could have the limbs on a separate texture page. So then, now you know you're going to have those two on 2 different texture pages, you can go in and move these UV shells around so that they all fit. So again, I've already worked through this, so let's just load in one that I've already done. So there we have the torso, and that, ignore that there, that is just where we have these pipes, which I'm not going to UV, I'm just going to use a shader to texture those. But what we have here is we have the torso all nicely laid out on one on one texture page here. What we also have, if I move that, select that there, just so we're just selecting the left limb. What we have there are the limbs also laid out on half a texture page here. Now the reason it's only on half is because later on I'm going to mirror these limbs across to form the other side, his right hand side, but then I'm also going to mirror those UVs across to this side here. So we'll have all 4 limbs on one texture page, and that'll allow us to apply different textures to each side. Now to an object like this, you're probably going to have 90% of each side is going to be the same, but you don't necessarily want the same dirt, you don't want the same wear and tear, and if there's any sort of text which is going to be overlaid onto this, if you apply it to this arm, it's going to be mirrored on the other side. Now there are tricks to getting around that, like using sort of adding the text on as a polyplane with an alpha channel, so that it doesn't get mirrored to the other side. But for this, because we want different wear and tear on each side, it's worth going in and just having the left and right limbs separated. So that, if I just select it all, so that is how we approach UV mapping this space loader. As you can see, we've got our torso, which is ready here. We've got our limbs, our left arm and our left leg, which are ready on here. Again, once you've mirrored those limbs across, you can mirror the UVs across here, and then you're good to go. So the next step, now we have the UVs ready and sorted, rather than running straight into Photoshop and start painting up textures, we're going to stay in Maya for a while, and we're just going to let Maya bake out a few starter textures for us, and that's what we're going to look at in the next video.